Welcome in, everyone. So glad to have you here. We'll just wait 30 seconds for everyone to arrive and get settled, and then we'll get started. Okay, the clock has struck. I'm going to kick us off. Welcome, everyone. On behalf of the Center on Reinventing Public Education at ASU's Mary Lou Fulton College, I'm so glad that you're able to spend the next hour with us for a research briefing and a panel discussion about CRPE's report, The Transformation Gap: Why Motivated District Leaders Pursue Incremental Change, which published last month. I'm Chelsea Waite, and I'm a research principal at the center where we study education policy and systems to help leaders and advocates boldly reimagine public education so that it delivers on a promise to support every student's success. And I'm joined today by my colleague, Michael Berardino, who will present our research findings. We're also privileged to welcome three panelists for a discussion. Kathy Greeter served as superintendent at Farmington Public Schools in Connecticut for 16 years before retiring in January. Congratulations, Kathy. Bill Kimball is a veteran superintendent and is serving his 8th year as superintendent at Maple Run Unified School District in Vermont. And Jess Rose is a longtime public educator and administrator, now senior education program officer at the Barr Foundation, which supported the study that we're here to discuss today. You'll have to stay in your seats just a little longer to get to hear from this stellar panel. We'll start with a briefing on the research report, and then around the 20-minute mark, we'll transition into a discussion. Feel free to use the webinar's Q&A function, and we'll do our best to answer as many questions as we can by the end of the hour. So to introduce this study, I'm going to dive right into the middle with a surprising statistic: 98%. That's the percentage of New England superintendents who said that they feel personally motivated to lead transformational change in their districts. That represents 292 superintendents out of the nearly 300 who responded to this question in our region-wide survey from last fall. So, what is transformational change? In that survey question, we deliberately didn't define it. We really wanted superintendents to think about their own context and the kind of change they want to lead. But our research team had a working definition, which you see on this slide. I want to draw your attention to two parts in particular that strongly informed our research. First is that transformational systems change happens when districts redefine their purpose and operations. They're developing a new vision for schooling that will support every student to thrive, and a strategy for how the district as a whole will progress toward that vision. And then second, transformation requires the fundamental redesign of multiple core systems together, not just tweaks to curriculum or schedules, but deep changes to the design of the instructional core and to people's roles across the school system. And that means challenging assumptions, changing mindsets, shifting power. And we developed this definition with input from an advisory group of education leaders and advocates in New England. The feedback that we got was that this is an aspirational and high bar for school districts, but it's also exactly what districts need to meet this moment of increasing strain that so many of them are under. Districts are battling intensifying political and fiscal pressures that make it harder to close learning gaps and reduce absenteeism that worsened during the pandemic. At the same time, they're facing rising expectations for what students will need to be prepared in a fragmented society and an AI economy. And then on top of all of that, a system that was never designed to produce fair access and equitable outcomes at scale, and where persistent achievement gaps are growing now, not shrinking. In these circumstances, the question facing school districts is not whether change is needed, but how to change at the speed and the depth demanded. Incremental improvements will not be enough in these circumstances, and leaving inherited structures and practices in place in many cases is not a neutral choice when the evidence shows that fundamental changes implemented well, like detracking, more relevant instruction, more collaborative planning time for teachers, can reverse outcome gaps, re-engage students, and retain teachers in positive working environments. And so, with this motivation in mind, and with that working definition for transformational systems change that you saw before, we fielded a region-wide survey and conducted 47 interviews in New England. We wanted to understand what superintendents envision for their districts, how much change they themselves think is needed, and what they are actively pursuing, including what is shaping their decisions about which changes to pursue and when. We sent this survey to every superintendent in the 6 New England states. And for the interviews, we reached out to superintendents whose districts had published a strategic plan or a portrait of a graduate that had indicated a transformational vision for the future. And so, with this framing in mind, I'm going to hand it off to Michael to share more about what we learned.
Thanks so much, Chelsea. Hello, everybody. So I'm going to go over 5 findings from our report, and this will just be a quick overview. We encourage everyone to read the report and for more detail on a lot of these items. So the first major finding from our research was that the need for transformation across New England is contested. So that we saw, especially as it relates to our definition of transformation systems change. But what we saw is that superintendents do not have a shared understanding of what transformation looks like. And there are a small proportion of leaders that picture a fundamental redesign of the goals of schooling and how school works. But many others look at this quite differently. I'm going to show you 2 data points to show you how we came to this conclusion. So first, we asked leaders about what their long-term goals were for their district. And here at the top of the chart, we see almost universal agreement on what we consider to be very traditional goals: improving academic achievement, improving instruction. But near the bottom, we see there's much more divergence in terms of long-term goals around uh, goals that would expand the purpose of schooling. So, access to post-secondary education, durable skills, strengthening career preparation. So here's where the first element where you see the understanding of transformational change is contested. We also asked leaders what level of change is needed in order to reach their long-term goals. We asked them about 15 core areas of district work that are tied to our definition of transformational systems change. I'm not going to show you all 15. I'm going to show you the 2 highest rated and the 2 lowest rated. And so here are 2 elements where the majority of survey respondents said that there's substantial change required for how your district uses artificial intelligence and how teachers teach. Um, on the other side of the spectrum, 2 elements where less than 15% said substantial change is needed is how your district places students in courses and how adults in your district treat students. And so here you see that there's a real divergence in the level of change that leaders think is needed to reach their goals. And importantly, a lot of what they said is small change or even no change is needed in order to reach their long-term goals. And if you think we pulled out 2 quotes that really exemplify kind of the range in how leaders thought about transformational systems change. One leader said, there's 21 different strategies I feel like I can implement to really modernize the system. So they want to tackle a lot, and they feel like a lot is needed in order to improve for their students. While another leader said, I really preach stability as a goal. So that's in that small change needed understanding of change. So then that brings us to our second finding, where we found that transformation in New England is pretty rare in practice. Um, Most leaders are working to improve the systems as they are today, rather than, oh, sorry about that. Um, they're working on the systems as they are today, rather than redesigning how they operate. When we asked when we asked the leaders about what they felt like needed to change, the substantial change areas that we showed in the previous slide, even smaller proportions are actually working on those right now. So even the leaders that feel like change is needed, they're actually fewer are working on this year. But we also asked them directly, what are you working on right now? What is your most ambitious work? So in the survey, we had an open response question that we asked them, and the responses we got were primarily about instructional matters, curriculum revamping, HQIM, tier one, strengthening tier one instruction, critical aspects of a district. We're not trying to diminish the importance of this, but this is more of what how schooling works, and these are more foundational things, and they did not highlight more ambitious work that they were doing. In the interviews, um, many of the superintendents we talked to are they have aspirational visions. That's why we talked to them as part of the interviews. But when we actually ask them what they're actually working on right now, it's much more strategic. It's within the existing structures rather than fundamentally redesigning them, or it's very much in the early stages of what they're working on right now. So I want to go back to that statistic that Chelsea shared. So we had 98% of leaders said they're motivated to pursue transformational systems change. So then why is it that we're seeing so little of this? Um, we really, this suggests that they report wanting to lead transformational change, but they're really talking about different things. And maybe more importantly, whatever they imagine transformation change to be and what they're pursuing tend to be much more familiar, bounded improvements. So we see motivation, but varied understanding and limited action. So we really sought to answer the question, why is that? I'm going to go over three explanations that we found for why they're pursuing more bounded, familiar improvement strategies rather than more transformation change. I'm going to go through these relatively quickly because we really want to have our panelists who can speak about this firsthand instead of me trying to summarize what other people may be working on. So the first explanation uh, the of why leaders are pursuing these changes and how it's shaped is exposure. So we learned that so much of what leaders work on is shaped by what what they're exposed to, what they've actually seen through their, and this oftentimes is on a very individual basis. So their participation in networks, them doing their own learning, attending conferences on their own, what they learned in their graduate program from a mentor. But what this isn't is often this exposure is not built into how districts work. And so what happens is most districts, most leaders are not regularly exposed to new ideas. Um, One leader shared, we get stuck in our world, in our classroom, and we forget that there are so many resources and good stuff out there. So this really shows how when you get insulated and isolated in your community, in your district, you're not exposed to new ideas, and therefore you don't know what else is happening out there. The next explanation is what leaders pursue is really shaped by what they feel is the highest priority. And at this point, for most leaders, the highest priority is stabilization, making sure your basic foundation is set up right now. And so what we see is even with leaders that have an aspirational statement, they know they want to change things. They feel like their capacity is completely consumed by just making sure the district operates smoothly and increasingly working on shoring up the instructional foundation for their teachers, especially coming out of COVID with a lot of novice teachers, and they feel like there's a lot of work they need to do to just make sure that teachers can do the basics. One leader said really clearly that even on a good day, just 20% of his attention can go to his district's strategic priorities. The rest is what he called the whirlwind. And I always say, like, superintendents have so much on their plate. They're trying to push instruction and assessment changes. They're trying to change all these things, but they also have to make sure the buses run on time. And that's just a lot for any leader to take on. And importantly, what this does is it leaders feel like they need to shore up the foundation before they can then work on anything more innovative or ambitious. And so it ends up being a sequential thing. They need to establish this before they can move on to the next thing. And the last explanation is that what leaders pursue is shaped by what they think is feasible. It's really shaped by what they can make tolerable for their most influential stakeholders. So the role of the superintendent involves constant negotiations with key stakeholders, and they're always hearing, but also oftentimes anticipating what their communities and stakeholders will tolerate, and then they adjust accordingly. This is parents. We've heard stories that parents organized and pushed back a successful detracking program that had started in a high school, or union and community opposition to new models like micro schools. And so this is a very real reaction to stakeholder pushback. And as a result, leaders scale back, slow down, soften their initiatives to something that they think is more feasible and palatable for for their stakeholders. And this is rational. This is very rational, but over time, this is quietly narrowing what even counts as possible and kind of enters into their mental models. Throughout these, you see that a lot of the obligation for change is still heaped entirely on district leaders themselves. They're the ones that have to build the coalition. They're the ones that have to come up with the ideas. They're the ones that need to worry also about the stabilization. And so a lot of this just feels like it's piling on for leaders. And so when we thought about the implications of what this means for how to improve this and how do we get to a point where we have more transformational change across New England. Really, what we focused on, it's not about asking leaders to do more. Leaders already have a lot on their plate, but really what this led us to is thinking about the conditions that can enable more ambitious leadership. And so we were thinking about and the ecosystem that's around leaders. And so we thought about four areas that will require a fundamental shift. First is how leaders are prepared. And so we see that leadership development programs and systems must systematically expose leaders to different models of schooling and really help leaders build the political and strategic skills needed to redesign, not just manage district systems. So really the constant political negotiation of that is limiting the existing ambition of programs right now. Second, how leaders spend their time. Right now, we feel as though school boards, state policymakers, and others, they should really support superintendents to radically reduce the time required for compliance, operational, and financial issues so that leaders have more capacity and more time to worry about and work on the political and adaptive leadership that transformation requires. How leaders understand their role. And so here we're thinking about how we can reshape incentives to shift the superintendent's role from just politically constrained and reactive to something where they have more, their part of their responsibility is support and for redesigning core structures. And I think a lot of this, we think school boards can be positioned as active stewards of long-term transformation. And finally, how leaders build and engage support. And here, we're thinking about having a much more um, collectivized responsibility for change. Like, so that right now it's the leader's responsibility to kind of motivate the change, say why it's important. But what happens if we have funders, advocates, community and business leaders who can organize and build coalitions that really deepen the public understanding of why change is needed, why transformational systems change is so crucial at this time, and then really reinforce the new norms about what schools can and should be. It was a lot, went through quickly with the hope that we can hear much more intelligently and coherently from people that have actually lived this experience themselves. I'm going to turn it back to Chelsea at this point to introduce the panel.
Thank you so much, Michael. And panelists, please turn on your videos, join us at the table. I'm so glad to be able to have this conversation today because Michael just presented, the region-wide results, sort of a big picture. And here we get to hear from Kathy and Bill, who have a personal experience of this work and who have worked to advance transformational change in different ways in their own districts. have their own views on what that means and what gets in the way. And so we're privileged to get to have a conversation with you today about your experience. And then Jess comes from a place of supporting a number of districts across New England who are pursuing a transformational vision and are working to do that with in a network together and with support from Barr Foundation in many ways to help to resolve some of these challenges that tend to shape superintendents' work more towards the incremental change area um, to shape to change those conditions that lead them toward more incremental change. So we get to hear from all three of these perspectives on some of these questions. So I'd love to start with Bill and Kathy to hear from you. In the study, nearly every superintendent who responded to the survey reported feeling personally motivated to lead transformational change, and we found that incredibly encouraging. Our data also shows that leaders have very different ideas about what leading transformation means. And so, as one current and one very recent former district leader, can you tell us about what has motivated you to do the job of the superintendent, and in particular, what pursuing transformational change really looks like in each of your districts?
So, for me, the motivation to become a superintendent started very early in my career. I was very lucky to be exposed. That slide that talked about exposure. I was in Hartford Public Schools in Connecticut for 16 years, and I had exposure to Lauren Resnick's 9 Principles of Learning. I went away every month to the University of Pittsburgh. Then I was fortunate enough also to have exposure to Richard Elmore, which he really helped me understand the power of the instructional core. And when you really fundamentally have to change the way students are learning so that learning is irresistible for students and reflects what the world of work, college life is presenting in 10 years when those students graduate. So I also was very lucky to be exposed to Michael Fullen, Ron Berger, Zaretta Hammond, John Maida, and be part of networks along my journey. So I was really motivated to become a superintendent because of all of those individuals who really instilled in me a transformational mindset when it came to looking at an entire community and changing the learning experience for the students within that community. I think in my experience, when it comes to transformation, it really had to do with creating a student-centered, future-oriented vision of what we wanted students to know and be able to do, not just in graduation, but every single year of their education. And we aligned every system, structure, and routine in the district, fundamentally changed every system, structure, and routine in the district to align to that vision.
Can you give folks a couple examples
Yeah,
of that?
sure. Yes. Yeah.
That
So
would be helpful.
when you do that, you're not just transforming teaching and learning. You're looking at hiring. You're looking at budget. You're looking at facilities and how you're going to align all of those systems, how we hire, who we hire. And you look at all of those systems from the lens of your vision. And for us, the design of the vision was really critical because it had to be bold, aspirational, but it had to include equity and excellence for all, not for some, not siloed in innovation, but transformation for all students. That was a critical design feature when we were designing our improvement documents, and the main one being a vision of the global citizen, which was paired with a new instructional model because the way in which we were teaching students would never get students to master the elements of our vision of the global citizen. So some of the innovations that came out of that were fundamentally different than what we've ever done before had to do with student-led conferences, mastery-based learning and grading, absolutely changing the way we graded students, not for behavior, but for mastery of learning targets, mastery of content, choice in the way that they showed that mastery, and deeper learning integrated units of study where students tackle big issues that our world or community are facing. And that engaged our community to really partner with us. The Land Trust in Farmington started having students come to the Land Trust to do the pollinator unit with our elementary students. So it ignited a lot of enthusiasm and inspiration in our community from business owners and from the town government. Everyone wanted to be part of these deeper learning units to support our students. And it was highly motivating. And our surveys of students, how they experienced school, was it changed dramatically. We also started new career pathways, and we ended up doing capstone courses and capstone. Before you graduate, you complete a capstone project that has to do with something you're passionate about. So those are some examples, but it required us,
Great.
like was said in the presentation, to interrogate and be very critical of ourselves. And that was done through improvement routines. We had all of these routines in place, whether it was instructional rounds or case studies of our own students. We would take a student and say, we don't believe that this student is where they should be. So we would do a case study, or we'd look at a business case study just to learn from others. And how do we interrogate everything we do and really redesign it to align to our vision and to support students to be global change makers?
Thank you so much. Bill, would love to hear from you. You're in a different
Yeah.
context,
Well,
different.
there's it's really uncanny. We were talking the other day when we were together, how much Kathy and I have very similar experiences and never met each other till we were in this project. But one of the things I said the other day, and I think I have to start with what my definition of the superintendent is. And I say this to people already. I have two prime objectives. I'm the educator of adults, and my job is to inspire leadership of all students, adults, everyone in the community. So like I really feel like that's my job as a superintendent. And it really brings me a lot of energy. I said the other day, invigorating. Well, I know some other superintendents don't feel that way, but there are days that are always tough to come to work, but those are far and few between for me. And I think that's a piece of realizing that I was telling my daughter this the other day. I'm more of a consultant. I'm not the owner of the school district. That's the people. That's the public. My job is to help us come together and look for that vision. And I've been really inspired for a long time. I think back to the leaders, as you were talking, Kathy. I was thinking about the people who brought me into leadership. You were talking about Hartford. I was in a district known as Lamoille South, which is north central Vermont. Back in the late 90s, early 2000s, I had great leaders there who brought me into administration, my first time into administration, and really nurtured my education. And that's that belief of like, you're an educator of adults if you're an administrator. So how do you help others grow? And I try to pay that forward to everyone, including to today. I know a conversation I had this morning with a group of teachers who are doing some work for us. And so I really see that piece. And the other piece that's really central for my work is students. You know, adults listen to kids a lot more than they do to each other. And so one of the big strategies that we've used, and we've partnered with some different groups here in Vermont to really elevate the voice of the students, especially middle school and high school. We're doing that. That happens in classrooms with all grade levels. I don't want to say it doesn't happen for the younger kids, but a great example is when I first came, we didn't have a student board rep. There had been years before, but then we had a different governance change that had never been put back. And a group of students wanted to put a student board rep, which like, sure, that'd be great. And the board had the wisdom to say, you guys decide how you want to figure out who's going to be the student board rep. And they came back and said, no, we want a group of students, not one person. So we have it's a group I meet with weekly. And they've led most of our change efforts. They led our building strategic goals, and vision and mission. They led our equity policy development in our district. they facilitate it all. They're all trained facilitators now. And they led our strategic plan development. And then this year, besides the administrative team reporting on where we think we are with strategic plan, the students are reporting. So they report first when we talk about one of the goals, and then we come in second. That's really moving our community forward, because it's not a debate process when that happens. And one of the things that's really core for me that I look at is I look for leadership ideas outside of education. And that really came from a mentor I had for many, many years of, I'm a devourer of Harvard Business Review. I read other things from business and outside the education community, but I think there's a lot we can learn from outside of education. Leadership is leadership, and inspiring leadership is, I think that's the thing that just gives me juice every day, no matter who it is, of like, how do I get others to see their part of the vision and the mission of the school district, and then internalize that into action for themselves. And so that's what I think is really pivotal of making transformational change. I also agree with the statement from the research that can get eaten up by the incremental operational things that you need to do. And I think it's trying to find that time. And it's really important to say, like, when am I doing that work, and that alignment between the board and the superintendent for the board to give you that avenue to go do that work.
I want to pick up on that in just a moment. Jess, I'd love to bring you into this same conversation. What does Barr Foundation mean by transformational systems change? Why does it matter? What's the vision for high school that you hope that district-led transformational change can enable?
Yeah. When we talk about the need to change schools, we often at Barr use the phrase transformation at the root. And that's because we're trying to connote this need for deeper structural, systemic, and like stubborn mindset shifts rather than those marginal improving outcomes sort of approaches that we see from lots of folks, all built on that same model that we can see district to district to district. We think that type of change is really essential for a number of reasons. Today's schools, like you mentioned before, Chelsea, they were designed for different purposes and for different students than today. So it's not surprising that they don't get the results that we want for the students it was originally created for, and certainly not for the students that it was never intending to serve. And so if we want a generation of young people who can lead happy, healthy, choice-filled lives, at a minimum, and maximally solve the nation's and world's thorny issues that they are inheriting, we're going to need a different type of educational experience. So those reasons are more future-facing. But for us at Barr, what is equally, if not more important, is that we're also looking to the past and the present. Students of color, in particular, have been harmed by the educational system in the US for generations, both in their experiences and in their outcomes. And so schools often perpetuate and contribute to our country's racially unjust society. And our vision for high school, which requires district leaders to shepherd, is that all students, and particularly students of color and those most marginalized in our schools, can thrive in high school and in life after graduation. And so that is what we're really aiming for as our North Star as an organization.
Thank you. And I want to return to you in a little bit to ask about some of what you're seeing from the districts that you're working with. I think let's pick up on this theme that Bill just sort of started to raise a moment ago, around just the many competing priorities that get in the way of this work. We found sort of a clear story in our interviews, especially, is that superintendents are really rightfully focused on addressing foundational needs in their district, focusing on the quality of core academic instruction or stabilizing the district in a budget crisis. But leaders also felt like in the face of those issues, they couldn't take on more ambitious change efforts until they had addressed some of those foundational needs. And I'm really curious because this feels like an unsettled question to me, based on your own experiences, Kathy and Bill, and maybe Jess from what you've seen. What advice would you give to leaders who feel like their most urgent priorities have to be stabilizing districts and shoring up core instruction? Are they right that those are the most important priorities at the expense of others? And where does longer term transformational change fit in a leader's priority list when there are limited hours in the day?
Kathy, you mind if I kind of tackle that
Yeah,
first?
yes. Go ahead.
And I think we've served different types of districts. I have a high poverty district here in Northwest Vermont, and so it's interesting in the study. It talks about the difference between high poverty or high diversity districts versus ones that aren't, and what they're the ones that tend to have high poverty or high diversity tend to look at shoring up the instructional system. And I came to this about 6 months ago that as an educator, my social justice piece is to ensure everyone has not only access but achieves an education setting. I'm not here to take care of all the social justice problems, but mine are here for an education piece and to ensure that happens for each and every student. And so some of that is ensuring the instructional systems. And I can say that I have great educators in this district who care so much about kids, but sometimes that caring gets in the way. And so that will lower rigor at times for kids. And unfortunately, lowers the rigor usually for kids that need it the least to be lowered, which are those kids that come from marginalized backgrounds. And so in ensuring, one of the things I've been working on is really ensuring the instructional systems, but that's part of the transformational change piece. Because if we don't get those systems set, so kids have a certain level of competency, and I try not to use proficiency or mastery, but we can use all those words interchangeably. That there's a point, it's the old adage of if the student can't read, I can't really get them to learn other subjects. Well, I need a certain level of competency and durable skills that go across the content so then kids can start using their own choice and voice and what they want to learn. So I don't think it's an either or. I think it's a both. Both shore up those skills so you can get to that transformational change. And I don't think there's really, I kind of said that in an ordered, I don't think there's necessarily an ordered piece of that either. I just think it's part of it.
For me, stabilizing, a district comes from transformation and innovation. When you have a clear vision and you align all of your systems, everything towards that vision, and that vision is aspirational and student-centered, you end up stabilizing the district through the transformation. I spent my first 16 years in Hartford where I had many, many different superintendents. And each time we'd get a new superintendent, it would be a new vision, something new. And it was very challenging as a teacher, as a principal, as a central office administrator to have to shift so quickly and almost abandon everything that we had already learned to shift to this new vision. In Farmington, that wouldn't happen because it's so much a part of every system, everything we do. So it creates a lot of stability. It also really addresses a lot of the operation. If you think of that vision being aligned to operations, it ends up addressing a lot of the operational issues from a student-centered lens. So I believe that innovation is essential and must happen while you're working on the fundamentals or stabilizing the district. For me, it was a way of stabilizing the district and the lessons I learned from when there wasn't a clear vision, there wasn't a clear North Star. And so we ended up kind of just moving to the next thing without really integrating it into what we already knew. A great example, I'll give one example of this. In Farmington, the state put out a new teacher evaluation like requirements or system many years ago. And I remember very clearly it didn't align to our vision of the global city. It just didn't align to it. And we decided to not do it exactly the way that we were supposed to because it wouldn't have fit. And instead, we made a team goal. Teachers worked in teams on a goal that would advance our vision. And it had to be innovative. And out of that came mastery-based learning and flex blocks from one group of teachers who tried something new. And it came from the ground up because it was so responsive to what our students needed. So I do think there's a lot coming at us all the time as superintendents, but when you have a vision, you bring that into the system and you align it to the system so it's doable for your faculty, it's doable for students. It's something that parents and the Board of Education understand. And you say, here are the requirements. This is how we're doing it because this is how it will benefit our vision and benefit our students. So I feel that transformation is essential and should be at the forefront of what we do, not in secondary to fundamental or foundational types of things that you heard in the results from this survey and the research.
It's so useful and valuable to hear these responses, and they're echoing for me some of the things that came up in the interviews, some moments that are coming to mind. One where a leader said, by really shoring up our core instructional system, we are transforming our district and transforming outcomes for students. And so sort of that mental model of like transformation is making the system work the way that it should work. Others were sort of wrestling with this idea of, I know I need to put in place high quality instructional materials that are aligned to the science of reading. That is essential. We know that. And if I do that, that's actually going to sort of strengthen some of the core assumptions that we have about how instruction works and how the day is structured that I'm not sure I really want to, that are not part of my vision. So how do I sort of weave together what we know needs to happen and sort of what our vision is for what learning could be in our district? So it really, as I said when I asked the question, it feels like an unsettled question and one that we're hearing leaders wrestle with in a lot of different ways. Jess, what are you seeing from the cohort of districts that Barr Foundation is working to support?
Yeah, I think at Barr, we used to think of the school as the unit of change. And we really changed our mind over the last decade and see that district central offices are utterly essential to help lead school transformation and to simultaneously transform themselves and the way they operate. Um, we have found that we really need leadership at the central office level, the school leader level, and at the teacher level. That it's possible to make progress if you only have 2 out of 3, as long as you have the school leader. But it's pretty hard to get to systemic transformation if you don't have all 3. And to Kathy's point before, having teachers crafting ideas from the ground up, and from hearing both from Kathy and Bill about having a leader who's making strategic decisions to help guide that we're not doing everything that comes at us. Here's how we're going to make it coherent and strong. Like, you need that. We've also found this sort of fourth really important stakeholder who needs to be at the table from the very beginning, and that's students. So we don't see real transformation happening in schools when students aren't involved in meaningful ways as co-learners, co-planners, and co-leaders from the beginning. Like you heard Bill say about this group of students that he's meeting with every week and who is out front facilitating and leading. That is really where we see some of the biggest change take place. I think in terms of a process, things that we've really grown to feel are essential pieces are that schools and districts need tools to help look in the mirror incredibly deeply, to see the reality of what school is like and what it is producing for students, and then to be able to name the aspirations that they have and like really determine the length of that gap between those two pieces. And in order for them to do that, to your earlier point that Michael made, they often need to be able to go see other radically different examples in order to even see the wallpaper that they are existing within all the time. That the grammar of schooling is so entrenched in our ways of thinking and being that we are like blind to the systems that we have in place until we see something that looks so different that it allows us to question oh, wait, why do we do it that way in the first place? We often feel like districts need to have a lot of support to work on building their own competencies around racial equity before moving to action. And that without a clear North Star, so that they can say, like, what is our portrait of a graduate or a portrait of a learner? And translating that into an instructional vision or a framework of like, but how do we get to that? If it's just a poster on a wall without a clear roadmap of how we build it, it doesn't actually translate into change. Um, I think two other pieces are important learnings for us, that there's systems work that needs to happen, and very deep instructional work that needs to happen. And we see some schools try to go one route or the other. And in fact, we see them needing to be paired and nestled together across their transformational change journey. And if the schools and districts can't learn, I think this is to Bill's point about learning from lots of other leaders, learn how to become a learning organization themselves, they're going to really struggle, because this is not the type of thing where you can plan out a 7-year arc in a 2-day retreat and press go as if it's, it's going to work that way. You have to be so nimble and such a good set of learners that you can try things on and experiment and then pivot and change and grow constantly. We feel in our work at this point that it's pretty hard to find districts who can do that all by themselves. And so having a technical assistance partner that can support you, grow the capacity of those around you, and to lean in is often where we find the biggest bang for the buck in terms of time and resources. And so that's a learning that we are implementing more and more, of trying to help districts and schools have access to the type of technical assistance partners that would help them further faster the work that they most want to do.
Thank you. We're getting so many great questions from the audience. I'm going to throw out one or two of my questions and integrate some of these. I think this one sort of fits well with the theme of what we've been talking about. One of our audience members brings up that Brene Brown, in her recent book, spends a chapter on transformation. She makes a compelling case that genuine transformation involves a certain amount of deconstruction of the current system. How do you see deconstruction's role in educational transformation? And I would add to that, I think, if each of you might have sort of a quick example of something that you either deconstructed in order to achieve the vision that you set for your district and the community set for your district, or if you felt like something needed to be deconstructed and you haven't been able to or weren't able to.
I gave an example of the mastery-based learning that really is completely deconstructing grading, and how students are exposed to assessments that actually track learning targets and mastery of those. So it was basically completely redesigning grading and assessment in the school district, which again occurred from the ground up, seeing that if we're really going to be looking at students being engaged collaborators, empowered learners, self-aware individuals, civic-minded contributors, we need to be able to measure that, and through these the content through these learning targets. But students need to take control of that and know which learning targets they've mastered, which they haven't, and how to get support. So deconstructing grading, when grading was largely, if you remember in your own education, about behavior, about completing homework. In Farmington, you should complete your homework to master the content, but it's your choice. That is your choice. And it's not that you're going to get so many zeros that you can never come back from it. And that's an old way of thinking about grading. Another is, we de-leveled the humanities courses at our high school because there was really no reason to have 3 levels that we had. We really should only have an honors level and then a college credit bearing level. And so we changed that. That was hard work. That required a lot of professional development, and also having our students go out and and educate the community on the benefits of that and the benefits of mastery-based learning. Just like Bill, our students were great at presenting the why so that our community could accept the changes that were being proposed, so that the ways in which we leveled courses no longer benefited some students, it benefited all students because all students could take an honors level humanities course. So those are two examples of kind of deconstructing what we had done for years and years and years. And it took a lot of reading articles and bringing experts in and lots of time to plan and professional development for the faculty, and really having our students understand the why, and then they could communicate the why as well.
So I'm going to continue on the student voice piece. As I said, I told a story about how we came up with this group that gives me advice all the time, but they give a lot of others advice. When that formed 5 years ago, it really developed some jealousy amongst other student leadership groups that have been traditional in the high school. And so there was really it wasn't a dismantling, but a re-envisioning of what student leadership is. Instead of something you put on your transcript for a college application, like I got to be part of National Honor Society, I got to part of student government. It was like, no, that's not the point of this. The point of it is if you want to make a change in the school system, anybody can step forward. It's not a popular vote piece. And so we went from maybe about the same 40 or 50 kids across a 950 student high school signing up for leadership across all 4 grades to, I remember last fall, we had about 150 kids. We had to use the National Guard Armory to do the 2 days pulling out from classes for, what is leadership and what are you trying to do and what are the different groups trying to do so we don't have cross purposes. And it was just amazing to see the kids develop this over 3 years, but to pull apart the idea that student government's here to put on a prom or put on these fundraisers or do the pep rally, like those are nice events. And we have a group that does events. They want to do it. The kids want to do it. Like, great, go do events. But there's some other kids who really, they want to make changes in their school. And when that really, the evidence that came to me is I had a group of freshmen who came to me right a week before school ended back in June, who said, Bill, we're not having the same experiences across our pre-K elementaries. We have 3 of them that flow into the same high school. And I was like, oh, tell me more. And they were incensed. I mean, they got some parents behind it and all that, but it was again of like, well, what do we do? What they were like, Bill, what do you do about it? And I'm like, no, I look right back. So what are you going to do about it? It's that piece of that I said earlier of like, elevate their leadership. You've got some ideas. How can we make this work to transform the school system? So it's that, our number one client is students. And if we, like, one of the things that was a seminal piece for me probably 15, 18 years ago was a study that happened at BU about what has the best evidence for high quality teaching. And it's the student reviews of their teachers. They know what's working. They know what's not working and what gets them engaged and what doesn't get them engaged. And so that's a piece of tearing down where we had in our high school traditional systems that weren't really building leadership within kids, and the kids knew how to do it. They didn't need adults to come in and say. It was like, okay, how do I give you the platform and how do I give you the authority, responsibility, and accountability to get it done?
And I think I'll briefly just build on what Bill is saying here, because I often find I think he's hinting at this idea of transforming our roles and getting clarity on some of our roles, and that I think a lot of educators, their identity is deeply intertwined with their role. And that can be positive and create a beautiful inner fire, but it can also become an absolute hindrance when we're trying to change roles and it feels like a threat to our identity. And so when I think about the deconstructing, and you can hear a little bit about how are students relating to one another, about power and access and voice, and we often, when we talk, like we've put your transformational systems change definition out in front of educators and district leaders before. And a common thing we see is that they're quick to be able to say, like, yes, the system needs to change. Yes, those teachers need to change. And it's less likely we have to create an intentional pause to be like, but let's talk about you. How might you need to change? What do you need to let go of how you perceive your role and how your role needs to be? What do you need to learn and unlearn? And so I think of the unlearning piece as like an important part of our deconstruction of self. And the fact that, Bill was like, his job is to be an educator of adults and to inspire leadership of all those around him. There are a lot of other people who would have very different definition of what the superintendency is, and thus get a very different type of result. And so for a lot of our superintendents that we work with, they're at a crossroads of actually saying, I think I want to pivot to the left or to the right and try to become a new type of leader for a new type of school. And I think there's a lot of grief and of letting go that is deeply connected to our identities. That's just a part of that process.
Such a valuable conversation, and I'm just looking at these questions from the audience and feeling regretful that we won't get to them all. I want to ask one more in sort of a lightning round. You don't have to participate if you may, but see if you can kind of share the first thing that comes out of your mind. Two of our audience members are wondering about the role of school boards and school committees, and the provocation I'll put out there to sort of summarize the question is, could school boards expect transformational leadership from superintendents in a better or a different way? And I think this relates to the role conversation that Jess and Bill, you were just having, to the idea of who are the key stakeholders and customers for schools. So could school boards, expect and hold leaders accountable for transformational leadership in schools? Is there a way for that to happen in a productive way that could lead to more transformation?
It is a reciprocal relationship that you have with your board of education. I was very fortunate in Farmington. I had many different board members come through the board of education over 16 years. I think my role was the same role I've had for over 35 years, is to be the educator and bring to them presentations from students and from educators to really help them understand the power of the vision and with the community, so I could get the collective support of both the community and the Board of Education. And whether it was a budget meeting, whether it was a newsletter, our annual global showcase, every opportunity, a PTO meeting, every opportunity, I and others were talking about our vision of the global citizen and the power of elevating student voice and agency, and so that they are empowered global citizens. So I do think a board should expect that. And in my case, we have actual policies that say I'm the CEO. And so I was allowed to run the school district, and they were a policy board, and they definitely took that very seriously, but we each had our roles in the work. And it wasn't that they didn't question, they didn't say, can you clarify that? I need more information. I expected that, to have that discourse. But in the end, I think when we stay within our roles and we listen to our students, our educators, and hear what they need, I do think it ends up working out where you actually see transformation, and you can be very proud of, what's accomplished over time. When we're not in our roles, that's when things can get very tricky.
I'm just going to say ditto everything Kathy said. Totally agree with that. I'm fortunate to work with a great board, and it's also having that discussion, especially with the board chair, about like, what support do I need and what support do you need as a board, and understanding that tension between the board and the superintendent that's the learning edge.
Yeah.
That's where the learning edge is about our roles. Because you can write them all you want down in policy and everything else, but until you're living it and you have stumbles, it's like how you recover from the stumbles
Mhm.
and say, okay, so let's talk this out. How do we figure out that little edge that we went over one side or the other? I did it or the board did it, and we figured that out. And to know that that's natural. That's not a bad board. That's just a natural way of doing the work.
I think I'll just add like this piece of like wishing that school boards would um, allow their superintendents to focus. And that sometimes means like, what are 1 or 2 goals? Not what is a 12 goal year look like, which sometimes I see happen. And how are those goals like 7-year goals that we're building off of, not like every year let's change the flavor, and asking their superintendents earnestly, like, what are you learning, and
Yeah.
focusing the types of questions that school boards can ask send very clear signals to the superintendent and to the entire district about what is valued. And so if school board members are asking the central office every other week for a whole new data set on something different, and there's so many requests come in, central offices feel like they have to respond and reply.
Yeah.
And if that is confusing and disorienting and not purpose driven itself, then it is absolutely contributing to that superintendent feeling like, I can't focus, I can only give 20% to our vision. And so that would be my like, whew, my one big ask of boards is to like help your superintendent.
Jess, can I just tell you, I 100% agree. Ours were 10-year goals.
Yeah.
And the only one that would send me questions is the board chair. So it would be filtered through the board chair. And from a very, very early on in Hartford, I implemented a time management system. So I was in classrooms every week, and my board chair knew on that day or those 2 days, you cannot get a hold of me because I'm in classrooms and that's my priority. And and for me, it gave me the room and the space to really work collectively with all of the different groups in the school district to make change happen collectively. So
That
absolutely agree.
That is a great note to end on. Friends, we are out of time. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you so much, panelists, for sharing these insights. We have so many more questions. I want to think about a way for us to try to address them some other way. I'm just going to throw up one final slide. We have more research coming. We're doing deep dive case studies in 5 districts in New England that are actively pursuing transformational system change and that we're excited to share more about next year. And please follow along with CRPE's research in order to stay in touch. It's been such a pleasure being with you all today and discussing this really complicated piece of a challenge that we have in front of us about systemic transformation, not just in one district, but across regions and even across the country. Thank you all so much.